From Tokyo, my dear friends. Greetings. And I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And indeed, greetings is the appropriate word, I think, because today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to have a discussion with you, or continue to have discussions with you with respect to the works directed by the one, the only, the great Mr. Brian De Palma. And that brings us to a discussion of work from the year 1968, which is very famous, very infamous for a number of reasons. And it is also very significant in the context of the filmography of Brian De Palma and the like. And it is this work, again, from 1968, and it is called Greetings. So, as per our discussion format, let me just speak very briefly in a non-spoiler way first, and then later in this video, we'll go into more detail. So, for those who have not yet seen the film Greetings, I think there is a lot to offer here in terms of, as I say, the context of this film set against the backdrop of Brian De Palma's filmography. Also, it features a cast of, for example, Garrett Graham, Jonathan Warden, Alan Garfield, and Robert De Niro. And this film also is generally regarded, too, in the context of Robert De Niro's acting career. So it's interesting to see the quote-unquote early part of Brian De Palma's career intersecting with quote-unquote the early part of Robert De Niro's career. Indeed, Robert De Niro's character here of John is a very memorable one. I mean, they're all very memorable in their own ways, and John as a character, the Robert De Niro character, is himself also very memorable in his own ways, which we'll maybe get into more details in the latter half of this video. And as well as providing a sense of the use of the comic and also the way in which style and substance coincide. Here, the style can be said to be very much relying on a type of use of editing and tricks of the trade and use of speaking to the camera, as well as the episodic nature of the structure of the film, while also creating a sense of the wild and zany, but also the subversive, and also a sense of perhaps protest or revolution or rebellion, especially in the context of 1960s America, late 60s America, and specifically in the context of government and the Vietnam War. And so we have to remember, too, that the works of Brian De Palma, starting from Greetings and indeed going forward throughout his career, will in some form or another, in some degree or another, again, depending on what film we're talking about, of course, but in some degree or another, will be a type of intersection of a Brian De Palma visual style mixed into or cross-cut very directly with a sense of the substance. And the substance, in a lot of cases, could be intertwined with a sense of, say, protest, a sense of, say, subversive and critical and maybe even scathing indictment feelings against government actions, and those government actions take the form of, say, in this instance, say, overseas military campaigns and wars, such as the Vietnam War. And also that idea of how irreverence and a type of almost of a carefree attitude that we see on the part of some of the main characters. This could also be said to be linked to a sense of that feeling of rebellion or a revolution or indictment against sort of certain organs of society, etc. So, and as we see from the context of Brian De Palma's career, filmography, we see this type of quote-unquote cinema of protest combined with a sense of the bravura style, combined with a sense of the comic touch and the episodic sketch comedic timing that is oftentimes filled with levels of broad physical comedy, cleverness of dialogue, risque humor, oftentimes involving sex and sexuality, etc. All this is combined to form a type of overall Brian De Palma cinema experience. And in that way, one can say Greetings is very much sitting very comfortably in the Brian Brian De Palma film canon, as well as being a very intriguing film in its own way. So that is my way of trying to say introduce the film for those who have not yet seen the film. For those who are interested in the works of Brian De Palma, this might be a very exciting and intriguing place to go. For those who are interested also, as I say, in the early acting career of Robert De Niro, this also might be a very intriguing and exciting place to go. And then also for some of the other reasons, which I will try to elaborate upon with a little bit more detail in the latter half of this video. So this is Greetings from 1968. And so from here on, we'll be speaking about a little bit more detail. So if you haven't seen the film yet, I encourage you to turn off this video, and then you can watch the film Greetings in your own time, and then you can always come back. This video discussion will still be up on this YouTube channel. Before I go, though, so I should mention that you can find Greetings, I think, through a number of sources, through a number of various, say, releases that have occurred throughout the years on DVD or on Blu-ray. This happens to be my Blu-ray release, which I was able to get as part of this set, which is the De Niro and De Palma, the early films box set. And one of the discs that's included here is Greetings, as well as some other early films, which we will talk about in separate videos. This set, by the way, that I have is Region A, so that's just in case you're interested, but I know that I understand it can be made available in certain other select regions as well. So with that being said, please, and also there are other ways to get this film, I think. So I hope you're able to be able to find it and access it if you are interested, because it is, as I say, a very fascinating work indeed in the context of the filmography of Brian De Palma. It is Greetings. Okay, so you're back, so that means we can talk a little bit more detail about this film, Greetings. And I think we have a number of things, again, as I was trying to allude to earlier, a number of things that are at play at once in this incredible work by Brian De Palma, produced by Charles Hirsch, again, starring Jonathan Warden and Garrett Graham and Robert De Niro. So they play the characters of Paul, Lloyd, and John, respectively. There's also an appearance, for instance, of Alan Garfield as well, very memorable, brief and memorable one at that. So we have these three characters, these three young men that we seem to be focusing on throughout this film, either together or maybe in their separate world or their separate little stories. And it seems at the start to be focusing in on this notion of the draft and going to war and conscription. Because this was, we understand at the time in the late 1960s, this was the rule, this was the law. And so this was compulsory conscription or participating or being part of the military campaign. And of course, when we're talking about the late 1960s, America, we're speaking directly about the Vietnam. And we see this allusion, therefore, to the Vietnam War. And we understand that this word greetings, according to the great supplements that can be found in this era release, such as the commentary and supplements, etc., this word greetings is not just an affirmative, say, hello, not just an affirmative hello type of title, which might suggest, say, happiness and jubilance and a type of friendliness even. It is also, we understand, potentially interpreted to be a reference to the draft and the letter that people who would be subject to the draft would receive from the U.S. government. And so in that way, we have already within the title itself a type of subversive element that is combined with the element of the joyous or the comic. And that is, I think, a great way to think of this film, Greetings. There are those that it is multi-level. It has a sense of the comic timing and the irreverent. At the same time, it has a sense of protest and has a sense of currency of the socio-political consequences of the time that would have affected people of the generation of these characters that we meet, John, Paul, and Lloyd. And so it's very much loaded with, I think, a lot of meaning in that way. And we see, of course, that being further elaborated upon by the opening with a reference to Lyndon Johnson, And so this type of feeling of distance, because Lyndon Johnson is shown in the television setting and the news and the media, which is also going to come into play at the very end of the film as well, in terms of news and media and coverage of the Vietnam War. And also we have a type of distancing effect between what is being said in terms of the official line of the government through the government's number one spokesperson, in a manner of speaking, number one representative, that is the President of the United States. And at the same time, we have this type of distancing effect. And that distancing effect, I think, is also a type of echo or parallel to the contents that we'll see in this film, Greetings. Now, when we go into the actual character arcs or the character stories themselves, with John, Paul, and Lloyd, and for instance, Paul, the Jonathan Warden character, we have to start his attempts at trying to avoid being conscripted, avoid having to serve in the military. And we see the consultations between and among the men. For instance, at the opening with Greetings, he goes into a bar, and I think the idea is trying to get into a fight with some people in the bar. We don't see who's in the bar, but we hear it, and we understand that he gets into a fight shouting racial epithets at a group of African Americans in order to get them to injure him in some way, or get himself into a bar fight of some sort. The injury would then be used as a reason to avoid having to serve in the military, but it doesn't quite go the way he plans it. And so already at the top, we have so many things at once in terms of risque, social related, I don't want to say, there's a type of, I don't want to say commentary per se, but there's a type of reflection here of race and racist and racial tensions, attitudes that are already on display. And also we see how this type of attitude is reflected too in the way in which sexuality is being regarded to. There's a section here among the three of them about how one of the ways in which they're thinking of avoiding the draft would be, or to find a reason in order to not be conscripted, would be also to pretend that one is homosexual, when one is having one's official interview with the U.S. government representative. And so these attitudes are on display here. And so, we have to keep this in mind when we're watching it again from the perspective of 2022. This is a film from 1968. And so, but this is part of the discussion. This is part of the way in which these men are, as I say, trying to figure out ways to essentially dodge the draft or get out of having to serve in the military, because for them, the overlying pressure and fear of serving in the going to war, and also the potential of dying, as well as a type of maybe social political what's the phrase? A social political protest intertwined during this period is ever present, and yet at the same time unspoken. So I think this is a very important point to keep in mind. And the fact that it's unspoken means that we can therefore look at this film Greetings from various potential modes of interpretation. It can be seen as a comedy, it can be seen as an irreverent and a very stylized comedy, and indeed it is that, but it also has that element of the protest, and also has the element of sort of political discourse, and also has the element of, yes, a type of even indictment, if you will, of certain quote-unquote societal norms or mores that are on display and being displayed here in the storylines of Greetings. So there's a lot going on here from the very outset. And then when we speak about the style, I think we also see how Brian De Palma and company they have dialogue scenes. For instance, the dialogue among the three men in the store, you see how it cuts from one vantage point to another vantage point. It's still the same dialogue, but it's continuous. But you see that they are positioned differently, and indeed in the background or the foreground, some of the other characters that are there in the scene that aren't speaking, then they switch roles, and there's a totally different situation. It's like the same dialogue scene is shot from two completely different angles and completely different perspectives, but they are edited together in a way to create a seamless thing, but again, edited, exchanging positions every so often in terms of the edit. So here we've seen this a type of editing style already even in a work like Murder a la Mode. And indeed, we might see this in future film discussions of the filmography of Brian De Palma. But already here we have a sense of the fragmentary and also the sense of the episodic. This is almost like a sketch comedy routine that is relying too on an editing technique that when one looks closely, it becomes something that is self-referential. And so it has that very playful quality to it as well. It's often been described as being maybe akin to, say, Jean-Luc Godard or French New Wave, Nouvelle Vague. I think there's a lot to be said about that type of technique as well. Editing in the same place from a different vantage point. That's creating a sense of maybe either euphoria, a sense of freedom and excitement, or a sense of chaos and a sense of confusion. And I think that can all be happening all at once. And I think that is, again, a furtherance of this hypothesis or interpretation of this film Greetings as being multi-leveled, something that's maybe looking one way from one vantage point, but then has a completely different slant and bent when looked at from a different vantage point. So, and it's expressed in visual terms in this metaphor that's really great, as well as being an exercise in great style that we will see furthered throughout the film. And then various modes of cinematic style, I think, are engaged here. We see them, the men either together talking, and sometimes their discussions go towards how to get out of conscription, military conscription, and then goes towards how they are speaking about women and sex and sexuality, and it then goes into a way in which these two lines, as a sort of fundamental point, they seem to blur and they seem to cross over into each other. And so we have this way in which protest and a subversive element is also combined with the idea of sex and sexual urge and sexual liberation. I'm not saying that one is necessarily inherently in line with the other, but what I am saying, there seems to be this type of same kind of discussion that's happening either in parallel, in tandem, or some way or another along the same timeline. And so there might be some strong connection thematically, or indeed socio-politically and even culturally, or there might be just a way in which these various elements are combined together, as an example of the multi-leveled aspect of this film, Greetings. Be that as it may, I think the interpretation of, in line with the former, namely that there is a strong link between the expressions of sex and sexuality and politics, can be said to be a very strong interpretation, especially when we're talking about the character of Lloyd, Garrett Graham character, because this is the character, as we know, is focusing in on the assassination of JFK. And some of the elements, some of the scenes with him involved and speaking to the camera, they are very directly related to sex and sexual intercourse, and nudity, and in particular nudity of female bodies, etc. And so this becomes this very almost complex and quite challenging intersection between sex and politics. And so I'm not sure what the specific, I mean, I think there are many potential interpretations as to what the statement or statements might be from Charles Hirsch and Brian De Palma respectively, but I think one interpretation could be this idea of a sense of maybe one way of looking at type of counterculture, or for lack of a better phrase, counterculture, and a sort of freedom and liberation from, at least in the context of how one views sex and sexual relations with women, in terms of Lloyd's perspective, because Lloyd, we see Lloyd and his take on women and his relationships with women as he speaks about it, or as we see it depicted on screen. That's also true for characters like Paul in terms of the computer dating. It's also true for characters like John in terms of what he does with his own camera work, and the person that he meets in the bookstore, and then what happens a little bit later with the filming and the filming session and the screen test, as it were. So there are these relationships here, but in the context of Lloyd and the JFK assassination, it seems to be very much a type of relation to sex, counterculture, freedom, liberation, but also how that freedom and liberation might be said to be for lack of a better phrase, almost conspiratorial in the context of discussions of society and politics and recent current events, a la the JFK assassination, which would have been a very recent event when we remember 1963 versus this film, 1968. So again, a multi-leveled film in that way. And then, of course, we have the story of the Jonathan Warden character, Paul. We understand that there is this, through title cards, conscription is underway for him. And at the same time, while that storyline is being revealed to us, either through title cards or assumption or rumor, we also have the storyline involving computer dating and the various women that he meets, we assume, through this dating process. And so there's this interesting line of parallelism between, again, sex and politics, even with his storyline as well, and that is also combined in a way that creates a real opportunity for a real, almost intense, and in from some perspectives of some people and some viewers, quite graphic scenes of sexuality. Again, that also could be said to be quite disturbing and quite even to the point of maybe being the reason why this film received the X rating that it did. Very famous in terms of being the first film to receive an X rating by the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America. So. And I think some of the reasons that have been cited in terms of the scholarship is this cross section, this quite disturbing cross section, at least from certain perspectives anyway, of sex and politics. And so we also see it in the storyline of Jonathan Warden's character Paul, and also indeed to the character of John Rubin. This is the name of the character portrayed by Robert De Niro. We see him emerge a little bit later in terms of his voyeurism, his links, the way in which he links what one might call intellectualism, or maybe if one is cynical, pseudo or quasi-intellectualism on the one hand, and voyeurism on the other. And it's almost a way in which it justifies acts of perversion, which is a very interesting and quite in itself a subversive viewpoint on art, on the perspective of art. And indeed, this is a really interesting link with an earlier film that we discussed, Murder a la Mode, and also it could be a link with other films that we will discuss subsequently in the Brian De Palma canon filmography. So very fascinating viewpoint on art and creation of art and films within films, and the notion of screen tests, because we see the way in which screen tests and voyeurism is used as a way almost to manipulate on the part of John and the woman that he meets. And so there is this kind of very sort of artistic surface level point, which is itself very potent. At the same time, it reveals or suggests things that have an air and a tinge and a quality of the disturbing, and perhaps even for a number of people, a very direct quality that suggests something that is disturbing. So, but this line too is also running parallel to John's own story, the Robert De Niro character story too, because again, like the other characters where you have this merging of, say, sex and politics. If John's story, the Robert De Niro character's stories, the sexual aspect of that story is involving this idea of voyeurism and the bookstore and the like, then we also have this the idea of politics, because John's story does end up in Vietnam, or at least you understand it in terms of a depiction and representation of Vietnam with the newsman there. There is a sense of theatricality to this type of sequence as well that ends the film, or one of the end sequences of the film. So that's a very interesting, I think, maybe comment on art versus reality, or art within art. But in any event, the idea is, yes, he is serving in the military, and there are some scenes involving his interaction with one of the people who live there or who's found there. And so there is a means by which we have a scene of war. And this will maybe recall other films that we might see in the future that have a direct reference and direct discussion and dialogue with the Vietnam War and American military presence. For example, Casualties of War, which we'll talk about later. And then there's also this almost playful and even maybe disturbing and quite maybe naive way or naive quality in the way in which the media is depicted, and linking back to the bookending of the image of Lyndon Johnson, as almost a way of suggesting a sense of naivete on the part of maybe a certain interventionist thinking, which itself could be the way in which this film is being subversive and quite a kind of indictment, if you will, of what it sees as being military maneuverings overseas. So this is, again, the intersection of sex and politics in the storyline of Robert De Niro's character, and indeed too this idea of the of how this is related to not just sex and politics, but sex, politics, and death. Because of course, war is inherently linked to the concept of death, which is a very frightening concept. We do see aspects of death and conspiracy in the context of Garrett Graham's character Lloyd, and the paranoia and tension in terms of, is he a target by the government because of what he knows of the JFK assassination or not. We kind of see and get a sense of what happens to his character, and it may or may not be as a result of that, and the like. And so we see not just the intersection of sex and politics in this film, but we see sex, politics, and death. And then we also see at the same time, and the vertical axis, the intersection between comedy and protest all at once in this film, which is so exciting in that way, for that and so many other reasons. That is this film, Greetings. Okay, my dear friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers. Greetings.